Some maps simply tell us where places are, but others, they hide stories so extraordinary that at first glance, they seem almost impossible to believe. Welcome to This Explainer. Today we are examining a map that conceals a historical secret so profound, it permanently altered the geopolitical chessboard of the modern world. This is a story of an expanding empire, a desperate and sudden sale, immense hidden wealth, and a dramatic shift in global power.
It begins with a fundamental geographical mystery. Every time we look at a map of the United States, Alaska feels entirely different from the rest, not just because of its enormous size, but because it simply doesn't seem to belong there. How exactly did a piece of America end up completely isolated thousands of kilometers away from Washington, D.C., and actually closer to Russia than to most American cities? Most people assume the answer is straightforward. Perhaps America conquered it in a forgotten war, or maybe it had just always been American territory. But neither of those assumptions is true. The real story begins far across the globe, within one of history's greatest empires, an empire that never intended to create a part of modern America. To truly grasp the spatial absurdity of these borders, imagine you are planning a road trip from one American state to another. You pack your bags, start the engine, and begin driving north. But a few hours later, you hit an international border. You are forced to leave the United States entirely. For the next 2,000 kilometers, every single road sign, every town, and every law belongs to Canada. Only after crossing that vast, sprawling wilderness do you finally reach another border, where you enter the United States once again. It sounds completely illogical on paper, but for anyone driving to Alaska, that is the daily reality.
Section 1. Russia's disappearing soft gold. To understand how this map was drawn, we have to travel back in time to the 18th century. During this era, the Russian Empire was expanding with relentless momentum, pushing deeper and deeper into Siberia, an unforgiving wilderness of frozen forests and towering mountain ranges. But these explorers weren't searching for farmland, they were chasing animal fur. In the 1700s, fur was one of the most valuable commodities on Earth, commanding extraordinary, premium prices in European and Chinese markets. And the ultimate prize among them all was the sea otter. Its fur is incredibly dense, possessing nearly 1 million hairs per square inch. Russian merchants prized it so highly, they began calling it soft gold. In 1725, Tsar Peter the Great ordered a highly ambitious expedition led by navigator Vitus Bering. Despite facing brutal conditions, severe scurvy, and violent ocean storms, Bering's expedition successfully crossed what we now know as the Bering Strait. They discovered the North American continent and, crucially, massive populations of sea otters. This discovery sparked a frantic rush, leading directly to the establishment of Russian trading posts and settlements all along the Alaskan coast, such as Novo-Archangelsk, a town we know today as Sitka. On paper, Russia now controlled a vast new territory in North America. But maps can be deceptive, because claiming ownership of land and actually controlling it are two very different things. For the Russian Empire, the reality of governing this remote colony was simply crushing. 7,000 kilometers. That is the sheer distance from St. Petersburg to Alaska. Imagine trying to project power and govern a territory that incredibly far away long before the invention of airplanes, telephones, or modern steamships. A single written message could take months just to arrive. Essential supplies had to be painstakingly hauled by horse, sled, and riverboat across the absolute entirety of Siberia, before having to survive a highly dangerous voyage across the turbulent North Pacific. Maintaining this colony was becoming incredibly difficult and financially draining.
History shows us that empires rarely fail from one single catastrophic event. Rather, they weaken through a slow compounding of unavoidable problems. And Russia was facing a severe crisis. First, the coveted sea otter had been aggressively overhunted by the merchants, causing their primary source of profits to completely collapse. Second, the fundamental costs of supplying and maintaining the remote colony were rising every single year. And third, the devastating 1853 Crimean War had placed enormous, breaking pressure on the broader Russian economy. Suddenly, Alaska wasn't just an expensive colony anymore. It was a highly dangerous liability. Russian officials became paralyzed by the fear that if another war broke out with Britain, the incredibly powerful British Royal Navy could easily sail from neighboring British North America and seize Alaska without a fight. Facing financial ruin, Russia realized a harsh truth. It was better to sell the land than to watch the British take it for free.
Section 2. The Midnight Purchase. But who would actually buy this massive, frozen, indefensible territory? Russia absolutely refused to sell it to their fierce rival, Britain. Instead, they looked to a nation that was rapidly expanding its own footprint across North America, a nation that had just survived a brutal civil war and, surprisingly, maintained a very friendly relationship with Russia, the United States. In the spring of 1867, two completely different geopolitical motivations brought these nations to the negotiating table. On one side was the desperate pragmatism of the Russian representative, Baron Edward D. Stokel. His singular mandate was to eliminate an expensive, indefensible liability, and to do it as quickly as possible. On the opposing side was the ambitious foresight of U.S. Secretary of State William Henry Seward. While the vast majority of Americans were entirely focused on domestic rebuilding in the aftermath of the Civil War, Seward imagined a much larger America. He didn't look at the map and see an isolated wilderness. He saw Alaska as a highly strategic bridge, a vital stepping stone to a future Pacific empire.
The resulting negotiations were quiet, intense, and highly secretive. When Secretary Seward learned that the U.S. Senate might soon adjourn, he knew he couldn't afford to wait. On the evening of March 29th, the international negotiators met directly at Seward's home and worked continuously through the night. Lawyers frantically rewrote complex paragraphs by hand, while the rest of Washington slept in darkness. Finally, at approximately 4 o'clock in the morning on March 30, 1867, the midnight signing took place. For the sum of $7.2 million in gold, the United States acquired more than 586,000 square miles of sovereign territory. When you break that math down, it equates to roughly 2 cents per acre. In a single, quiet night, America had secured one of the largest land purchases in modern human history.
But the American public did not view this massive acquisition as a victory. Far from it. When the news finally broke, widespread confusion and mockery followed. Newspapers across the country filled their front pages with highly sarcastic headlines, famously dubbing the purchase Seward's Folly and Seward's Icebox. Politicians and the general public alike brutally ridiculed the idea of spending millions of taxpayer dollars on what they genuinely believed was nothing but useless glaciers, endless snow, and polar bears. For decades following the midnight signing, the territory remained sparsely populated, largely ignored by Washington. And for a long time, it truly seemed the harsh critics were right. It looked to the world like America really had purchased a frozen, worthless wasteland.
Section 3. Fortune Beneath the Ice.
History, however, has a persistent habit of hiding its greatest surprises deep beneath the surface. For nearly 30 quiet, uneventful years, William Seward's grand vision offered very little to show for itself. The extraordinarily harsh climate naturally discouraged settlers, and there were no obvious, visible signs of wealth to be found. The national jokes about Seward's icebox simply continued, and then a dramatic pivot that changed everything. Ordinary, desperate prospectors who were exploring remote Northwest rivers with nothing more than simple shovels and pans made a discovery that instantly and permanently silenced the critics. They found gold. And not just a little gold, they uncovered one of the richest, most massive gold deposits the world had ever seen. The news spread globally like wildfire. Thousands of people abandoned their homes, quit their jobs, and crossed oceans to rush north into the freezing wilderness. The territory that was once universally dismissed as worthless suddenly became the one destination everyone on Earth wanted to reach. Almost overnight, the United States stopped laughing at William Henry Seward.
But gold was only the beginning of the story. As the 20th century progressed, geologists began to heavily suspect that an entirely different kind of treasure was hiding beneath the frozen permafrost. In 1968, their theories were proven correct when drilling crews at Prudhoe Bay made one of the most significant oil discoveries in North American history. They found billions of barrels of crude oil. But there was a massive problem. The oil was trapped deep in the Arctic, incredibly far from any functional, ice-free port. The solution to this logistical nightmare was an absolute engineering triumph: the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. Stretching over 1,200 kilometers across jagged mountain ranges and unforgiving permafrost, this massive infrastructure project entirely transformed Alaska's economy, and it secured a vital, independent domestic energy source for the United States. Looking back, the original $7.2 million purchase price now seemed like an absolute fraction of the staggering wealth the territory generated.
Section 4. America's Arctic Front Line.
But the immense wealth and natural resources was only part of the story, because the true, lasting power of Seward's purchase ultimately lay in its hidden geopolitical value. While engineers were busy discovering riches beneath the ice, military planners in Washington were slowly realizing the true, unmatched power of Alaska's physical location on the map. If you look at a traditional flat map, Alaska looks entirely isolated, tucked away in the top corner.
But look at a globe, and the perspective shifts completely. Alaska doesn't sit at the edge of the map at all. It sits directly at the strategic crossroads of two major continents. It isn't an isolated wilderness. It is an absolutely indispensable bridge, bridging the Pacific Ocean directly to the Arctic.
53 miles. That is the entire, shocking distance separating the United States and Russia at their closest physical point in the Bering Strait. Lying quietly between them in those freezing waters are two tiny islands, Russia's Big Diomede and America's Little Diomede. The proximity is staggering. On a clear day, you can literally stand on sovereign American soil, look across the water, and see Russia. Very few places on Earth bring two major, nuclear-armed global powers into such immediate, tense physical proximity.
This unique geography inevitably turned Alaska into a zone of rapid, heavy militarization. In 1942, during the height of World War II, Japanese forces invaded and occupied the Aleutian islands of Atsu and Kiska. It was the first time foreign troops had occupied sovereign American soil since the War of 1812. Almost overnight, Alaska became the nation's violent front line. And then came the long shadow of the Cold War. Military strategists quickly realized that the absolute shortest route for intercontinental ballistic missiles and long-range bombers traveling between the US and the Soviets wasn't across the vast oceans. It was directly over the Arctic. In response, the US built the Distant Early Warning Line, a vast, high-tech chain of radar stations stretching across the Alaskan wilderness. And even after the Soviet Union eventually collapsed in 1991, history didn't stop. As global sea ice melts and new, highly contested shipping routes open, the Arctic's geopolitical importance has only grown. Today, Alaska remains a critical, highly active defense frontier, guarded by advanced radar networks and fifth-generation fighter aircraft.
The story of Alaska reveals the deep, unsettling fragility of history. Think about how easily this entire timeline could have gone differently. If Russia had simply waited a few more years, they might have lost the territory to Britain in a devastating war. If the U.S. Senate had voted differently, or if that secretive late-night, midnight negotiation in 1867 had failed over a minor disagreement, Alaska might never have become American. A single quiet decision by William Henry Seward, a man heavily and publicly ridiculed in his own time, permanently prevented Britain from expanding its North American empire and permanently prevented Russia from maintaining a heavily armed stronghold in the Western Hemisphere. Nations don't just grow through the sheer force of military victories. Sometimes their borders are defined by a fragile, highly unpopular, but bold vision.
We look at world maps every single day, and we simply accept the borders as inevitable, permanent facts. But history isn't just a record of the past. It's a tool for understanding the seemingly impossible, razor-thin decisions that actively shape the reality we live in today. Alaska isn't just a strange, frozen state floating awkwardly in the corner of the map. It is a profound testament to destiny, to geography, and to the power of human vision. Which leaves us with one final thought. What other impossible stories are hidden right in front of us, simply waiting for the map to be read differently?